In this video, we're going to download and install the Android 5.0 SDK using a feature of the Android developer tools called SDK Manager. The thing to note is that just installing the Android developer tools as we did doesn't necessarily install the right version of the SDK, so we need to actually take this optional step to make sure that it's all configured correctly. Now, just a quick reminder, this is for the Mac. If you're running Windows, refer to the separate section on Windows because the functionality and what you need to do is just slightly different. But if you're on a Mac, let's proceed. Okay, first things first, we need to go into our folder that we created when we installed the Android developer tools. So I'm going to double click into that. If you recall, up here I created a developer subfolder and put all my files in there. So I'm going to go into that ADT bundle folder, and I'm going to go into the Eclipse folder, and I'm going to double click on Eclipse to start that up. Now, as shown in the previous video, this is my default workspace, so I'm going to leave that unchecked just so we can see that each time the video starts, but that's in the right place. And that's, of course, ultimately where all the files are going to be recorded. So I'm going to go into the Eclipse menu, click on Preferences, and then I'm going to go down here to Android and click on that and just expand it. I'm actually on the first area. Now, what you'll see here is that it's by default, there's only one target name, and that's Android 4.4W. Now, what that means is, firstly, 4.4 is the previous version of Android. That's Android KitKat. So, number one, if you wanted to create apps for the latest version, version 5, we couldn't do it at this stage. But secondly, by default, the W is the Wear 4.4 wearable version, which means it's really the software development kit exclusively for devices like watches and so forth. So in other words, you're not going to literally be able to create an app with this that works on a standard Android device. So in other words, we need to go ahead and install some additional software development kits before we can proceed. So we're going to cancel out of that. Now I'm going to go over here to Window and click on Android SDK Manager. Now, that's a separate program that was installed at the time we installed the Android Developer Tool project, and essentially it enables us to go through and literally download and install any version of the Android SDK. Now, the first time you look at the screen, you can find it's a little bit overwhelming. You can see down the bottom of the screen it's currently downloading. It's now completed. Now, that's going onto Google's servers and looking for all the versions of Android, because literally, if we scroll down and have a look, we can go right down back down here to Android 1.5, which came out years ago. If we wanted to, for some reason, develop for a really old device. Now, we obviously don't want to do that, but what we do want to do is install that latest version, version 5. So what you'll find is when you are actually looking at this, usually the SDK Manager does a pretty good job. In this case, it's automatically selected Android 5.0. API 21. Now that, of course, is, as I mentioned, that is the latest version. That's the Android Lollipop. So that's what we actually want. Now there's all these extra things on here as well, so we don't necessarily need all of those. I'm going to deselect some of them, and you can optionally decide whether you want them, but I'll go through and just discuss some of them first anyway. Firstly, documentation, we want to keep that. That's literally just some documentation about the latest version and, basically help. So you want to keep that one. Now, you'll notice here there's two API platforms. There's the Android SDK platform. Then down here, there's the Google APIs. Now, essentially, there's two versions here. We're going to start off using the SDK platform, but the Google API enables you to also access Google Maps and so forth. And later on in the course, we're going to be using that. So we're going to download both the Google API version of Android 5 as well as just the regular Android one that isn't specific to Google. And just to be clear, the version that isn't specific to Google does not have maps and a few other Google-specific things. So I'm going to leave that SDK platform in. Now, these things here are for Android TV. Android Lollipop version 5 announced a lot of support for Android TV, but we're not going to be dealing with that in this course, so I'm going to deselect those. Now, these three things down here are system images, and we'll definitely be using those. And what they are, they're Android virtual devices. So they enable you to run Android on your machine. So if you haven't got a physical Android device to plug into your computer, or if you have one and you also want to run a virtual machine, a virtual device, these things here you'll need to select. Now with version 5 of Android, they've come out with now a 64-bit edition, so there's now 2 versions. Prior to that, there was only the 1 version. Now this one here, ARM EABI, we're not going to be dealing with that in this course. That's really an older version that is much slower, and it's not something we need to deal with. We're only going to be dealing with the 64-bit and then the regular 32-bit version, so we'll keep both of those. Then likewise down here from the Google's APIs as well, we're going to deselect that one. So we end up having quite a few things, as you can see there, and we've also got the source code for Android. Well, we aren't going to be dealing with editing of the source code for the software development kit itself, so we're going to deselect that. Once you do select everything, it is always important just to scroll up and see what else you've got ticked. Now you can see often they'll install additional things, so you just really need to be conscious of what you're installing. Not that it really matters, and you won't get into any difficulty, but it's just good to know what you're actually installing ahead of time. Like for example here, the Android SDK Build Tools version 21, we would probably want that one as well. So I'm going to click on that as well. Because 21, again, the revision 21 stands for Android Lollipop, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. So we've pretty well installed everything, but if we scroll down, there's also a few other things. The Android Support Library. Now we do want this. This is one other thing. This is where you're targeting a previous version of Android. What will happen is that these additional files will be sort of included in your app so that it can actually run on an older version. So we most definitely do want that as well. And again, you'll find that the Android SDK Manager did a pretty good job of figuring out what we needed. So at this stage, we're ready to install. So we're going to go over here and click on Install. And that'll bring up this dialog. And what we need to do is for each of this sort of subsection, we need to click on it and accept the license. Now, sometimes when you select this, there can be 2 or 3 things you need to click. But in this case, there was just the one. And now we've got green ticks across the board. So we can click on Install. Now, at this point, you can see down the bottom left-hand corner of the screen that it's downloading the Android SDK tools. And it will progressively go through and download and install all the things that we need. So you can see it's still downloading. So it's going to go through and download absolutely everything, and it's just a matter of us sitting here and waiting until it's all downloaded. Obviously the speed, how long this will take, will be dependent on the speed of your internet connection and also the speed of Google, because these files of course are all being downloaded from the Google server. And you can see at the bottom left hand corner there, it just mentioned that it was unzipping. So this is automatically installing it as well. So the good thing is you don't have to sort of go into zip files like we did with the Android developer tools. Once this is completed, we will have installed it, and we'll go back in just to verify that with in Eclipse, and you'll see that the new SDKs will actually be showing. Okay, so I'm just going to pause the video for a little while and come back when it's just about finished so we can continue. Okay, so I've resumed. You can see it's getting close to the end. One point I will make is that you probably don't need to download all of these. So if you've got a slow internet connection, or you've got a certain quota of gigabytes you can download per month, you could probably do without downloading all the Google ones, and then without downloading the 64 image. In other words, you could just basically take those off, and literally just leave that image, and then also leave the documentation and the SDK platform. Either way is okay, because later in the course when we do use the Google APIs, you can always install it then. The other thing I'm going to do after this is finished, I'm going to delete the old 4.4W that we talked about earlier. And you can see that that's installed, the SDK platform, just so we don't get, it doesn't cause any confusion later. Because you can find often when you've got multiple versions of Android, it can get a little bit confusing as to which one to use and what to select and so on. So we might do that as well. We'll actually delete that. So we're just left with a clean slate. So I think we're on the last download there now. So once this is done, we'll go ahead and delete that package. Now you can see we've got a message on the screen to say that the Android SDK and also the Android Virtual Device Manager, which we'll talk about in another video, have been updated. So we're going to essentially just saying we need to close this down and relaunch it for the changes to take effect. But we're going to do that shortly anyway. So the other thing now is we've done that. We want to make sure, whenever you're deleting something, you do want to make sure that you don't accidentally have something else clicked and delete that as well. So in this case, nothing else is clicked. So we're just going to go into here. Oops, wrong one. I mean here. I'm going to select just that one package, and you can see that's the one that's installed over there under the status. And over here, I'm going to click on delete one package. Click on yes. That way we're not going to run into any issues later. You can see that the screen's now updated and it's no longer installed. So at that stage, we can close down the SDK manager. And what we'll do is, just to make sure the changes are reflected, we're going to close down Eclipse. And we're going to start it up again. Click on OK. Then we're going to go back into our Android preferences. And you can see now we've got two APIs in there. We've got the Android 5 for Lollipop, which is just a generic Android version. And we've also got the Google specific version. And as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the other system images in another video when we get into installing an Android virtual device. Okay, so at this point we're done. We've now installed the Android SDK version 5, the Lollipop edition, and we're ready to proceed.